Today we welcome Owen Marcus. Owen is a pioneer in men's emotional wellness and the founder of MELD, Men's Emotional Leadership Development. With nearly 3 decades of experience, Owen continues to coach entrepreneurs and develop programs for major companies like Google. Today we chat about relational leadership on the Communicative Leader. Hello and welcome to the Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On the Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. So, Owen, thank you for joining us today on the Communicative Leader. I'm really excited to learn more about what you do. And before we kind of dive into that, can you give us a little bit of your background? So, you're an expert in relational leadership, particularly in regards to men's emotional leadership training. So, just a little bit to help us understand kind of how you got there and, the passion for this.
I pretty much got here because I needed to get here. It was driven by my need to learn to, not just communicate, but really, I think this is probably where you're going with your communication skills. It's to really connect and relate to people. And specifically, the impetus for me to start working with men 30 years ago was that I realized my relationships with women weren't bad, but they weren't where I wanted it to be. And I needed to up my game. And I decided that maybe working with men would help that. And one thing led to another. And I didn't think it would end up being a business of mine. But it has, just because, particularly with men, I find that I thought it was, but I wasn't the only one. And we were lacking a lot of these skills, primarily for 2 reasons. One, we weren't taught them, or we didn't have models on how to be authentically present or communicate or connect with people as a man, and also the stress and trauma that we've all endured.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, and that's incredible. Especially, it's something that people, especially men, are starting to talk about, embrace now, but I can't even imagine 30 years ago how much of a unicorn that would have been. So thank you for leaning into that and being such an early adapter of that, a leader of it. So when a lot of what you do is relational leadership and you also bring in emotional leadership. So I'm wondering if we can kind of start with some definitions about what you see, how do you define relational leadership as how it relates to executive coaching? And then relatedly, how do we bring in the emotional leadership aspect as well?
One way I look at it is if I'm going to have a deep, serious, connected connection or conversation with you, I need to be present. And to be present, I need to, in some ways, be aware of my own experience. And I was a great example, in part because of my Asperger's, of being really disconnected and not aware of my own somatic or body experience or emotional experience or relational experience. And so the more a person, and in my case, it's usually men, but not entirely, can be aware of his or her own experience, a few things happen. By doing that, I feel safer because in a threat response, which is a survival or stress response, our orientation is external, as it should be. But as we can bring our focus internally, and not 100%, but at least peripherally, to our own experience, we're telling our body, which means our emotions and certainly our conscious mind, that we're safe. And right there, we downregulate. And the work of Stephen Porges and polyvagal theory and all his work with co-regulation tells us that when we're feeling safe, our nonverbals, the voice, the body movement, and the micro movements of our face and the little muscles of our face tells the other person that we're not a threat. So the other person downregulates and starts to feel safe and probably starts to display those same nonverbal signs, and I start to feel safe. So you get this co-regulation or co-connection using some of those mirror neurons. And so, as we all know, a lot of that communication happens nonverbally. And so we're picking all this up nonverbally and somewhat unconsciously, which allows for a deeper connection beyond just the words we're saying.
Yeah. Gosh, I love that. And I'm just thinking about being in a workplace when my leader just does that, right? That's again a workplace that I would feel really comfortable in or recommending anyone to work in. And unfortunately, no, that's not usually the case. But when people like you are doing this work, it is my hope that with time this starts to become more of the norm rather than the rarity that we're seeing. And thank you for those really detailed definitions and descriptions. It's really helpful. So, Owen, my next question was thinking about this focus on men's emotional leadership development. And you've kind of already touched on that in your introduction. But I was kind of wondering then if we already know what brought you here, at what point or when did you start to realize like, this is going to be a business? This is my passion. This is more than just me learning more to become a better communicator and kind of flipping the switch to I can help other people do this as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I started out almost 50 years ago in the integrated medical community, and I had an
Mm-hmm.
integrated medical clinic in Scottsdale. And then in '95 is when I got into all this, and I just wanted a men's group. Just so I had real
Mm-hmm.
authentic friends, and
Mm-hmm.
I did some in Arizona, California, and then I moved out to North Idaho and did something there. And then 20 years ago, I said, this model is really not working for me,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe not for everyone. So I took a lot of what I studied back in the late '70s and on and
Mm-hmm.
applied in my clinic, which is more the somatic work, and
Mm-hmm.
then changed the model of what a men's group would be. Asked
Mm-hmm.
11 guys, they all said yes, and then, oh no, I got to show up and create
Yeah.
stuff. Uh, so I did,
Mm-hmm.
and that group is still in
Mm-hmm.
existence, even though I'm not there anymore. I'm actually in one of their satellite groups, which is
Mm-hmm.
a Zoom group for the expats. But we have 60 guys in a group, and the group has had over 500 guys in 20 years as part of this
Wow.
group. A documentary filmed on the group and my work, and it has generated 3 businesses, and now it's my 3rd business. But about 15 years ago, the word got out that we were doing something that was unique.
Mm-hmm.
Men and other groups started coming to us and wanted to learn, what we were doing, or can you teach me to do it for my group? And I started traveling and doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gradually just became a business. And then when I helped start Everyman and brought all my
Mm-hmm.
technology or knowledge and created that company, it really took off. And then at the turn of the end of last year, I
Mm-hmm.
started Meld
Mm-hmm.
and really dialed in more of the science and the application of what we were seeing was really working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's incredible. I really love that it came from the demand from people around you, word of mouth and saying, this is really, really special. This is something that you need to know. So this leads us then. I imagine that, even with all of the great success stories and the positive word of mouth, I imagine there are some, especially with our culture, that will say, nah, I don't need emotional leadership. I don't need relational leadership. I need to be the loudest voice in the room, or that would make me appear as weak to my people. So what are some of these misconceptions that you encounter? So about either emotional leadership, relational leadership, especially among men in leadership positions.
Um, they don't usually say it these days directly, but yeah, you're right. I think
Mhm.
a lot of guys at least have that sort of cultural fear.
Mhm.
One of our clients has been Google or Google X, which is their R&D division. And several years ago, when they were looking at bringing us in, we talked to the COO and this English dude, and he said, this is all great, but what we really need is we need you to help our scientists ask for help because and that's the guy thing. We don't ask for help.
Yeah.
They're some of the most brilliant guys in the country, in the world, and they're
Mhm.
not asking for help because that's that masculine thing of, we don't ask for help.
Mhm.
But as expected, once we started working with them individually, these guys are great. They were, of course, brilliant, but they were really open
Mhm.
and they wanted it. And so often what we see
Mhm.
is, in the environment out there in the culture, there's a
Mhm.
lot of, particularly for men, these beliefs that we we follow this subtle agreement. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
classic one is, men aren't vulnerable, to cry is to show weakness, all
Mm-hmm.
that. But what we found over the years of doing this, when you create a safe space for men, which is really pretty simple, just like, what happens here stays here kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're doing it in co-ed settings, but I know in just gender or men settings
Mm-hmm.
that men pretty quickly open up. And it often takes
Mm-hmm.
one guy to take a little bit of a risk.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that man takes his risk. He says or shares something that might be vulnerable. And rather than the typical cultural thing of directly or indirectly being shamed or just
Mm-hmm.
ignored because guys don't know what to do, in this setting, the other men
Mm-hmm.
honor this man for his risk.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be in an emotional arena or just might be in a professional arena. And then
Mm-hmm.
that man, and really the whole group starts to realize that, oh, these really are different rules of engagement. So I
Yep.
can lean in. And then what often happens
Mm-hmm.
with men is we all know we tend to be a little competitive.
Mm-hmm.
So they often see who can be the most vulnerable because it goes from, I can't do
Yeah.
this to I need
Yeah.
to do this. I want to do it. And I can
Mm-hmm.
upstage
Yeah, I
John or
might be the
Fred here.
best.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yep. Oh, I love that. It's so it's in a way taking these kind of pretty typical rules of engagement, but then we tweak them just a little bit, and doing so open up, just like you're saying, this really nice safe space for more innovation and sharing and relationships, engagement, I imagine.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah, excellent.
and one of the things that's a core of what we do is this communal aspect. We have the
Mhm.
physiological aspect, and we also have the communal aspect and the
Mhm.
peer-to-peer connection. And that really gets into attachment theory, which I know you know about, which
Mhm.
basically says that as much as we're hardwired for survival, we're hardwired for connection. We need connection. So these guys,
Yeah.
and I was one of them, we need
Mhm.
authentic connection, and we don't have it. And the stats, and now more people are aware of it,
Mhm.
as men get older, we have less and less authentic connections. And, we have, as our Surgeon General says, an epidemic of isolation. And that's particularly
Yep.
true for men.
Mhm. Yeah. And so now I'm wondering, I was intrigued in preparing for our conversation about the somatic aspect. So you talk about the somatic awareness as part of your approach. And can you kind of tell us how this concept plays a role in relational and emotional leadership, and why it's important?
Um, Science is telling us now, and it's that we're a little 50 years ago, but now I think we hit critical mass with somatic therapy is
Mhm.
probably the hottest therapy for therapists to learn these days, because when I was learning it back in the late 70s,
Mhm.
we were way on the fringe. It was weird, and it's like,
Mhm.
there's nothing to it, it's stupid and new
Mhm.
agey and all that. Now it's the hottest therapy because it works.
Mhm.
But one reason it works is that, and I think we all sort of know this, but science supports it, is that when we have an experience, it's first a somatic or physical experience.
Mhm.
And so, we all know about the gut brain. So literally our
Mhm.
gut responds and the rest of our body responds. And it's not much different that, when you touch something that's hot, you're taking your hand away before you even know it's hot, before your brain knows it's hot.
Yeah.
So that kind of hardwiring we all have. So we are responding, as I said earlier, unconsciously to our interactions. And
Mhm.
then the next thing that happens is we might have an emotional awareness of it. That doesn't mean if we don't have an emotional awareness is that we're not having an emotional response. It's just that means that we might be aware of our emotional response
Mhm.
as we might be
Yep.
aware of our physical response. And then we might be aware of the thoughts. And that's usually where most of us start and
Mm.
stop, is that we have these
Yep.
thoughts. And then the thoughts could either be more coping mechanisms, survival mechanisms, reactionary things. You're my boss and you're telling me something,
Mm.
and I'm getting threatened, and I got all these tapes running in my head, maybe from past trauma, past training, whatever, and I'm getting myself all jacked up, and you're just
Mhm.
trying to communicate with me, and I'm tripping out.
Mhm.
And if you're a good leader, you're sensing that, and you're relaxed, you're
Mhm.
down regulating, and you maybe change your tack and have a different kind of conversation with me that directly or indirectly assures me that,
Mhm.
I'm safe, and that, whatever I might be thinking in terms of
Mhm.
a threat, it's not a threat. And because so often what we do is we bring our past into these situations. And when we're under stress, it's like our skeletons from the closet that we thought
Yeah.
we locked away start coming out, and we start even unconsciously expressing them. So, yeah, what we're working with men is getting them aware of all that. And rather than do it as a top down experience, we
Mm.
do it as a bottom up
Mhm.
experience. And we get them aware of the
Mhm.
physiology first. And then once we go from there, it's easy to be aware of the emotions and then what all that means.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting because I with a somatic experience, and you're talking about the skeletons from the closet, they're with you because they're living in the body, right? They're okay, excellent. That was my understanding. So then, Owen, I'm wondering if you can share an example with us with a client or a group, someone you worked with where you really kind of leaned more into helping them process these somatic experiences or traumas so that they were able to be more present or more effective.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what I do. I mean, sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
very subtle, just asking if you're, say, one of these guys and you're telling me or the group or whatever something, and I'm sensing there's a little disconnection. I essentially what I do is sort of slow you down. And one of the ways I slow you down to back you up, I might ask you, like, what do you feel in your body? I mean, I notice you're shaking your head, and as you
Mm-hmm.
do that, what's happening? And, I know that you're not hyper aroused or stressed now, but so what I'll often do is get the man to realize or experience what his body's expressing, because his
Mm-hmm.
body's expressing an unconscious experience that he's unaware of. As soon as he starts to become aware of it, something shifts in him. Like I said
Yep.
earlier, he's going to start to feel safer, and then he's going to be
Mm-hmm.
aware of his body, and that's usually not a threat for a man
Mm-hmm.
to be aware of his body. And so we might
Yep.
help him be aware of his body for a few minutes, and just simple questions that he can answer. Like, one of the simplest things, like in a group, a guy might start talking and start saying, telling a story or whatever. And one of the guys in the group might say, "Hey, Joe, you're losing me. Great story. It's
Mm-hmm.
entertaining, but I'm sort of spacing out because I don't feel you. You're
Mm-hmm.
just telling a
Mm-hmm.
story. Maybe it's a story you've told yourself or others
Yeah.
hundreds of times. I want to really feel you." And the guy
Yeah.
goes, "Oh, okay." And he often in the beginning he needs a little guidance, which gets into
Mm-hmm.
making him aware of his body, and when he starts to connect to what's behind his story, like a
Mm-hmm.
feeling, his whole
Mm-hmm.
expression shifts, his communication shifts, and it's
Mm-hmm.
congruent.
Yep.
And when we have congruency, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
we have rapport. And
Yep.
so it's not that he's lying to us before, but he's telling a story, and his body and his emotions are having a different experience.
Yeah. So you're able to show up as your whole self rather than just the story that isn't
And the other
landing.
person trusts you more, and you're more
Mm-hmm.
congruent, and you're building rapport. And at the end of the
Yep.
day, you both are going to be more creative, because when, if I'm that guy's checked out and I start to check in, I s-
Mm-hmm.
and I downregulate. What happens when I'm relaxed or I feel safe, I have much more access to all my resources. And one of the resources is
Mm-hmm.
creativity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent. And that's a perfect segue because I was looking at your work and I know authenticity is another major theme. So, how can leaders, especially men in traditional business environments, how do they cultivate a sense of authenticity in their leadership or just their peer connections?
Um, yeah, it's to some extent maybe understanding the model we're talking about, but more it's being willing to be authentic with your own experience. Again,
Mhm.
could start with the physical. And what I tell guys is the way to learn it is on the long tail. And it's pretty much true with learning
Mhm.
anything. I mean, if I'm going to train you to play basketball, I'm not going to give you a ball and put you on a court with a team of accomplished players. I'm going to, build on this particular
Mhm.
skills when when you can just work on a skill, you're not stressed, and then bring them all together and then put you on the court. And so for guys, I say, look, if this is a big lift for you, practice some of the skills we teach
Mhm.
by yourself or in our groups, which are safe, or, in minimally stressful situations until you get, the confidence and it starts to
Mhm.
be, consciously competent where you're doing it
Mhm.
unconsciously. And then what'll start to happen is when the stress starts to be more, either you'll be doing it naturally or you'll realize, oh, I'm stressed out where I never would have
Mhm.
realized before. Oh, I know what to do about that. I can just slow down, take a breath, feel my
Mhm.
body, make eye contact, maybe say something
Yeah.
that's a little vulnerable, like I'm just confused right now. A
Mhm.
lot of little cues that downregulates, connects us, and not only to our own experience, but to the other person.
Yeah. It's the way I'm hearing this is it really becomes a new way of showing up and being present and experiencing.
It is. And often guys come to us because
Mhm.
they're working more on their intimate relationship and maybe,
Mhm.
the relationship
Yep.
with family or kids.
Mhm.
But definitely, because most of my coaching clients are entrepreneurs and, some like
Mhm.
C-level executives.
Mhm.
Within a few months, those relationships at home would turn a corner. And
Yep.
then they start to see without much effort that it's starting to change the relationships at work. And then they want to work more on that. It's like, all right,
Mhm.
I'm getting the basic skills. How do I adapt these skills in the work setting?
Yeah, exactly. That's how I say communication is a yardstick others assess your leadership on. And that communication becomes so much better when you are aware of those skeletons and what's going on in your body. So, oh, and let's think about some practical steps. So, if someone is listening and they're like, okay, they're making some connections, they are recognizing, okay, this is a place they want to explore. What are some things that they could begin to do in order to be more present or to build better connections at work?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things someone can do. I mean, one whole section is just getting your body more relaxed. The more you
Mhm.
get rid of the chronic stress in your body,
Mhm.
and people have way more stress than they realize because
Yeah.
what happens is there's an inverse relationship. The more tense we get, the less aware we are. Uh,
Mhm.
and that's a lot of what I dealt with in my clinic. For average people, but also elite athletes, and they
Yeah.
tend to be actually more aware. So body work, yoga, meditation. I mean, all those disciplines will help
Mhm.
relax the chronic stress, make you more aware, and innately give you skills. I mean,
Mhm.
I got into all this through body work, and my body changed tremendously. But at the end of the day, probably the biggest thing I got from it was I became aware of my own body, and with that, my
Mhm.
emotions. And so,
Mhm.
what happens when you have that skill? You're not putting stress back in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, one of the old stories I used to have with my clients is that, they'd come in after a few sessions and go, my shoulders, my neck's bothering me. And I'd laugh. I'd say, look, it wasn't that problem, this problem. It was your shoulders that were really the tighter part because that's where you put your stress. Now
Mhm.
that you're more aware, you're feeling it.
Yeah.
And in the
Yep.
short term, that's not a good thing. But in the long term,
Yep.
that negative feedback is going to change your
Mhm.
behavior. So anything that teaches you how to know what you're doing is not working in the moment is
Mhm.
great. And then, one of the simple things I created is what I call the rock formula. And the rock formula is ROC, and R is to relax. So we
Mhm.
slow down to
Okay.
relax. The O is we open up to be vulnerable. When we
Mhm.
open up to be vulnerable to our own experience, which almost naturally
Mhm.
happens when we slow down, but we also open up to be vulnerable to other people's experiences. It could be compassion, it could be empathy. And then the C is we risk or reach out for connection
Mm.
and from that vulnerable place. And so
Yeah.
when I connect to you or anyone, and it's not like a big vulnerability, but just
Mhm.
being aware of my own experience kind of vulnerability, I'm going to get a different level of connection.
Yeah, yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think this is a really nice lean into this next question that I have about transformation. And you talk about transforming clients from commanders to lighthouses. So can you talk to us about what does that look like? What is that idea there?
Um, yeah, a couple of things. I mean, one of the tendencies we have, particularly with men, is that we like to give advice and we
Mhm,
like to help and rescue and all those things, which, it's not a bad thing, but that's our default. So one of the things I
mhm,
do, my partner's a couples therapist, and we do couples
mhm,
trainings and retreats. We're doing one in
mhm,
Costa Rica in a few months. And inevitably, I sit with the guy and he's really trying to communicate. I mean, to his wife that he loves and and it's not working. He's using all these emotional words and she's getting more distance, more pissed,
mhm,
maybe sadder or whatever, because
mhm,
it's not happening. And she sort of
mhm,
knows he's trying, and she knows in some level he feels it, but she's not feeling it. And he's
mhm.
getting frustrated, and you know how all that goes.
Yep.
So I sit next to Joe and I say, Joe, can I help? He goes, yeah, yeah, help me. And I go, all right, can I just sort of channel what I think you're really feeling? So
Mhm,
I just take a moment, sort of get a sense of what he's feeling. And I look at his partner and I start speaking from that place of being connected, feeling
mm,
and speaking from the feeling, not my head, but from the actual
mhm,
experience. And inevitably, within a 15 seconds, 30 seconds, her whole physiology shifts. Sometimes she
mhm.
starts crying
Yep.
because she knew he felt that. But
Mhm.
until I said it, she couldn't feel it. And then
Yep.
I go, and he's going, his jaw's dropping. He's going, yeah, yeah, that's what I'm feeling. And I go,
Mhm.
okay, Joe, you're going to say this. And I guide him. And so, particularly as guys, we don't know how to step out of using these emotional languages and fixing and
Mhm.
giving advice and just slow down, listen to the person, let that input be felt, not just heard, not just
Mhm.
thought about, but felt, and get the full experience and respond with the full experience.
Mhm.
And when we do that, what happens is, and this is what I teach men to do, is that you're not giving suggestions, you're guiding, you're mentoring. And
Mhm.
specifically in our work, what I have men do is take the man deeper into his experience, because it's my experience that, if I'm working with you, that you have all the resources you need. That
Mm.
said, because of stress, trauma, training, or lack of training, or whatever, some of these resources are disconnected from you.
Yep.
But when you're relaxed, they start to come
Mhm.
back. And so if I can sort of take you deeper into your experience, get you more relaxed, and help you connect to things that you haven't been
Mhm.
connected to, you'll start to solve the problem yourself. And so
Mhm.
you're really getting behind that person being his own commander, or her being his own commander,
Yeah.
and succeeding on their own. And then they learn that, they embody it, and you don't have to keep teaching it.
Mhm. Yeah. So I was thinking of my next questions about resources and tools. And we've kind of talked about these feedback mechanisms like yoga and meditation, but you're just mentioning how some of our resources through time and chronic stress and trauma, they kind of go offline until we can find a way to reset them. I don't know if that's the right term,
No, that's good. That's a good
but
way to.
is that a good term? Okay. So I'm wondering if you can kind of help us think through, and again, any suggestions you have for us, in addition to those you shared. And some of this might be the work that you're doing with Meld or your other companies or other books or practices, but how does someone listening, if again taking those kind of first steps to say, oh yeah, there's a lot going in here, I'm bringing this around with me, this is impeding my ability to make connections, so where do they start?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to start. You can start with, your primary partner and, maybe ask that
Mhm.
person for feedback. Um, You can, ask for friends for feedback. That's one way to approach it. Another way is developing what I would call a mindfulness witness. So, having this sense of dual attention. So you still have everything that you normally have. We're not going to get rid of that. So your mind still does what it does, but you start training yourself through your body, through your emotions, or whatever of what's sort of the undercurrent experience you're having. And again, you're probably not going to be all that good at it in a more stressful or demanding situation. But, in your light conversations with people, listening to what you're saying, sort of listening to what the other person's saying for the emotional content. And so you say something to me and it's like, what does it feel like? How my body, how does it respond? I mean, one of the easiest things to sense is, am I leaning in? Do I want more connection? You engage in me. Do I feel safe? Or, am I going into some kind of survival response, which is either going to be often a subtle form of fight, flight, or freeze, where I'm going to, basically be trying to get out of this. And the thing is, it might not be anything that you're doing in a specific way. It might be my reaction, because maybe, you just said something that unconsciously reminded me of my mother saying those things, which I never liked and couldn't do anything about. And then you start to develop more and more refinement. And so you start to realize that, you can call it intuition, but you start to realize, where are my unconscious or emotional responses coming from? And once you start to get to that level of awareness, you got choice.
Yeah, that's excellent. So fascinating. And I love that we're bringing this into the workplace, because I think for so long it has been church and state very firmly separated. And that hasn't done a lot of people a lot of good, in my opinion. So, Owen, my last two questions for you, they're tied together, and this is the way we end all of our episodes of the Communicative Leader. So I like to leave listeners with, a pragmatic leadership or communication tip. It can be an advice, it can be a challenge. So the first bit will be for our titled leaders out there, and then the second piece of advice or challenge will be for employees of all ranks across all industries.
I think in general, I would say connect, risk connection. And by that, I mean, risk a more authentic connection. And we all hunger for authenticity. And some people might call it vulnerability, and it might have some of that, but this quality of being real. And so if you're in an interaction as the boss or as the employee, what would be one thing you could do or say that might be a little risky, but would be more authentic? And it's like putting a pebble into, a calm pond, and just letting the ripples go where they may, and just notice your own experience doing it, and notice the experience of the other person. And so often that just shifts the whole conversation into a more authentic conversation, but into a conversation that's going to be more productive.
Yep. And I like that you notice too, and you raise up the point that it doesn't take much to kind of transform those relationships or those connections.
Yeah. And I've seen, with myself, but really with all these men I've helped in different contexts, as they come back and they apply something like this, and they're blown away of how well it worked with their employees or their peers, or maybe a client or a boss or whatever, where they shift the relationship rapport. Because we all are human, and on some level we want authentic connection.
And Owen, is that advice for mostly our friends in titled leadership positions? Do you think it would fare the same for, an employee who is not in a titled position, but just interested in a stronger workplace connections?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a fellow that I've helped that is an employee, and he's going to be in management because he's doing this.
Yeah.
And, it's work went from stressful to more enjoyable for him. And he's getting noticed because he's showing up in this authentic, powerful way.
Mhm.
and he's leading without even trying to be a leader. So they're going to
Yep.
make him a manager.
Yeah, because I think I'm just laughing too because it's with communication, right? I feel like for a long time, leadership communication has been on the fringe compared to more of a management or psychological perspective. But when you're showing up as a whole self and making those authentic connections, when people know they can trust you, that you are going to be honest with them, then that is really transformative in what that can do in a workplace.
Yeah, like we helped him not confront his boss, but yeah,
Mhm.
speak up to his boss, and she
Mhm.
loved it. She loved it.
Yeah.
And that was a big thing of like, you're showing up as a leader because people want
Mhm.
that.
Yes, exactly.
And that imbues the sense of ownership. And as an employer, I want
Mhm.
my people to have ownership, and
Mhm.
I want to support that. And with
Yep.
that, yeah, we're all going to make mistakes,
Mhm.
but more than that, we got to take risks.
Mhm. Yep, and we're gonna be a better collective when we're all embodying leadership.
Yeah. And to just sort of circle around, I think
Mhm.
the leader needs to be the leader in embodying leadership, taking risks, being willing
Mhm.
to make mistakes, own the mistakes. So he or she
Yep.
sets a bar for everyone else. And as kids, we learned these or didn't learn them
Mhm.
because our parents
Mhm.
were doing it. And now, not that the leader is the parent, but it's analogous where
Mhm.
we're going to take our lead from the person's in authority.
Yep, 100%. So people always ask, "Is there one tip?" I'm like, "Model it. Model
Yeah.
it." Is the best thing you can do.
And
So,
and with that, you're not going to get
mhm.
it perfect, but
Yep.
that's part of the modeling because when they see
Mhm.
your imperfection, that gives them a lot more authority to lean in and not work on being perfect.
Exactly. Oh, Owen, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I love what you're doing. And I think it's so important that we're integrating these somatic experiences, this vulnerability, and putting it hand in hand with leadership where it belongs. So thank you again for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's been my honor to be here.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on the Communicative Leader.